The mangekyou sharingan is cracked, summoning hellfire, manifesting giant chakra avatars, controlling opponents absolutely without them being able to tell. Needless to say, the MS provides all sorts of insanely useful abilities, but probably none more so than Kamui. This busted ability arguably took Obito from no higher than jonin level all the way up to the peak of the Akatsuki. However, despite how powerful and popular it is, many Naruto fans still are far from understanding it, with numerous Kamui misconceptions floating around out there even in 2025. So in this video, I'll be debunking those misconceptions, sharing some information with you that you probably didn't know, and overall showing you guys just how busted the best mangekyou ability really is. In other words, today we'll be exploring and breaking down why you probably don't understand Kamui. I know. You're sitting here thinking, Sage, I know how the phasing ability works. I promise you, there's more to it than you know. So stick with me, and I guarantee you that you'll learn something new. But as of right now, there are two different main interpretations of how this slipping or phasing ability works. Number one, Obito is normally solid, and intangibility must be activated, even if reflexively. Number two, Obito is always intangible, except for when he's actively materializing. To be totally honest, both of these interpretations are mostly valid, although I do lean in the direction of the second over the first for a reason I'll explain here in a moment. First though, let's look at the databook breakdown of Kamui. It reads as follows. The left eye hurls distant objects into the dimension by fixating on them. The right eye unconsciously makes a body part slip through it by transferring it. The unconsciously part is what's important. This lets us know that this does happen without Obito himself activating it, but the question is whether or not it turns off and on in response to stimuli or not. Think of the first interpretation the same way you would think of how your body reflexively moves itself away from a hot stove you accidentally touch. This isn't a conscious decision, but it's a reflexive one which occurs in response to stimuli, meaning that something happens, your body receives the signals, and then your body reacts to said signals in a particular way. The second interpretation would be more like you'd physically be unable to touch the stove unless you absolutely wanted to, even without stimuli or some type of detection method being necessary. Both of these interpretations continue to work even in the instances where Obito is taken off guard, such as the multiple times in the war arc when Guy phases through him despite blindsiding him. Some people will say that he would know that he's there due to his sensory, but we actually don't have any evidence that this is how that would work. But assuming that the detection process is fast enough, even if he doesn't know it's coming, the Kamui phasing would still activate upon the strike reaching whatever threshold it needs to in order to activate the intangibility, if that's how it works. However, one thing that does sort of throw a wrench into the mix for those who believe that there's a detection process necessary for the phasing is how Kamui reacts to Rin. Upon Rin dying, Obito tries to touch her face, but he phases through her. This is obviously unintentional, as he's trying to touch her face. So since he was able to punch and kick the Mist Anbu when he wanted to, and phase through their attacks automatically, even ones that were blindside attacks, one would think that this is based on Obito's will. When he's willing himself to be solid, he's solid, but when he's not, he's not. At least that's how it comes across to me. However, you could attribute this to him being inexperienced with the ability, although I think it's a bit absurd when you consider the fact that there are no such issues during the fight with the Mist Anbu, and he doesn't accidentally phase through the ground. The thing that convinces me that this is how this works, though, is the specific kanji used to describe this ability and the circumstances surrounding it. Both Obito and Minato use the same phrase with the same kanji, which is on screen. This literally means to materialize, but this is typically in the context of going from a non-physical thing to taking on a physical form, like a spirit becoming flesh or ideas materializing into reality. This would mean that prior to becoming material, Obito was in a state of being immaterial. If he's in an immaterial state until he makes himself materialize, which is what he says and Minato says, the Kamui phasing is truly passive. This would also be more in line with what we see with Rin, as again, we didn't see any accidental phasing through Obito's battle with the Mist Anbu, so even if we factor in inexperience, it would have likely been showcased during that battle and not just with Rin. Due to all of this, I think the most consistent interpretation of Obito's intangibility is that as long as his Sharingan is active, he's always intangible until he makes the conscious decision to materialize. This is commonly rebutted by people saying, we're told he can only be intangible for 5 minutes straight, so it can't always be on, which is almost correct, but not technically true. What's stated is that he can't have things phasing through him for more than 5 minutes straight. So as long as he doesn't have attacks constantly passing through him, the intangibility can remain active indefinitely with no contradictions. Another common rebuttal is, well, if he's always intangible, he'd be constantly hitting that 5-minute timer. This isn't true. The timer only applies to when he's constantly got attacks slipping through him, so he can theoretically be intangible in a way I described indefinitely without ever running into the issue of the timer, unless you assume that he's phasing through air molecules or something. And this is unlikely though, because Kamui does make concessions for his clothes, the ground, and even water molecules, so there's no real reason to believe that it wouldn't make concessions for air molecules. Now, you may have noticed earlier that I said so long as his sharingan is active, and not so long as his mangekyou sharingan is active. This was intentional, because something a lot of people are unaware of is that Obito can use this MS phasing ability with his base sharingan. We see this most notably with Konan. I believe the reason for this is because the Hashirama cells that his body is made out of amp sharingan abilities, so maybe it allows for this function to be carried over to the base sharingan. But regardless, this is something that he's verifiably able to do. The final thing I'd like to add here in regards to the phasing is that Obito can phase through objects after they've already touched him. We know this for a fact because we see it happen versus Konan. For some reason, people think that if an attack lands on Obito, then he's basically cooked, but we know that he's capable of phasing through Konan's paper bombs after they stick to him. Another good example of this is him using Kamui to phase through Shino's bugs, despite them being on him physically at the time. This shouldn't be a surprise though, as he can decide to phase through the ground after standing on it, and it's the exact same principle. But for some reason, people have the misconception that if something like Amaterasu were to land on him, then he's cooked, and Kamui just can't work there. Their argument is, well, if he teleports the part of his body the Amaterasu is on, then the Amaterasu would just go with that body part. But that's not what happens with the paper bombs, it's not what happens with the bugs, so it's not how it would work with the Amaterasu. This is backed up by the Fanbook 2 statement, which covers up to the 5 Kage Summit and says, all ninjutsu and physical attacks completely pass through it. Amaterasu is both ninjutsu and described as a physical attack, so there's no real argument that Kamui shouldn't work on it, even after being tagged. More on that later though. Before we move on to the next misconception about Kamui, if you're enjoying this video so far, maybe you've learned something, make sure to like and subscribe. No jokes today, I just want to say I appreciate all of you for the support. Another common misconception is that space-time ninjutsu like FTG or summoning/reverse summoning would allow for escape from Kamui. This is probably not the case. We're actually told outright that Kamui is inescapable in Data Book 3. In the section where it's talking about Kakashi using Kamui on Datara, the Data Book states, his ocular ninjutsu can bend and distort space. A target is hurled into a situation where there is no escape. Since we know that it's possible to escape from the barrier as you're being warped into it, as we see Datara avoid being hit by it, what it likely means is there's no escape from the Kamui dimension. Since this is Data Book 3, which covers up to chapter 402, and both FTG and summoning/reverse summoning are introduced prior to this, this statement should apply to those abilities. That statement alone should debunk any silly claims like Pain can resummon the paths that have been warped away into Kamui if they're fighting, or an FTG user can teleport out. But this isn't the only thing that supports this. In Data Book 3, the Viz translators did something interesting. They incorrectly call Kamui, along with Jiraiya's Gamahyoro barrier space, sealed dimensions. The kanji for sealed doesn't exist in either of these statements, but I think they did this for a reason. The actual translation comes out to barrier space, or barrier dimension, with the kanji for barrier there meaning barrier, dimensional barrier, containment zone, containment barrier, mystical barrier, and both Kamui and Gamahyoro spaces are stated to be places where there is no escape. So, I think the most likely reason they translated it this way is because Naruto English-speaking fans would be familiar with traditional barriers from which there is escape, where time-space ninjutsu do work, such as the barrier the Sound 4 put up around Hiruzen, who's still able to summon Enma. Since the understanding of the word barrier from your average English-speaking Naruto fan wouldn't carry the connotation of inescapability, they likely added that in to emphasize that inescapability of Kamui and Gamahyoro. Something else that supports this is another statement from Data Book 3 which tells us that the path of pain that was dragged into the Gamehiro had its activities stopped. Upon analyzing the kanji, this is something that's commonly used when speaking about an electrical system shutting down due to having its power source cut off, which makes sense in this context because the paths of pain are literally remote-controlled beings who receive their power from Nagato via chakra transmission into the chakra rods lodged into their body. So if the power source is cut off via being disconnected from the outside world, disabling said chakra transfer, the path of pain would cease to function. A common rebuttal to this is that the path of pain Jiraiya dragged into the dimension stabbed him with the Rinnegan rod, but it's entirely possible that that stab motion took place before or while the path was being dragged into the dimension. Also, the Rinnegan rod Jiraiya was stabbed with did disrupt his chakra, but that doesn't actually counter the argument. The black belt-like blades, also referred to sometimes as Rinnegan rods, are actually different from the black chakra receivers which are used to transmit chakra. They do produce a chakra disruption effect, but it's never stated or implied to be the cause of an influx of chakra through the blade itself. This could just be an inherent property of the blades since they're likely made of the user's chakra, but the chakra disruption effect doesn't necessarily require for Nagato to pour more chakra into them. But even if that is the case, it doesn't really matter because you could just say that whatever chakra was remaining in that path whenever the dimension closed around it just got automatically transferred through the blade into Jiraiya. Another rebuttal of this is that the path of pain was just damaged too much to continue operation, which would be fine, but there are three main issues with this. Number one, we've seen other paths of pain take comparable or even worse damage and still operate. Number two, if the damage is what did it and Nagato was able to transmit chakra into that path, he'd be able to locate the path, which he's unable to do. Number three, the most pragmatic reading of the databook statement lends credence to the idea that being pulled into the dimension is what causes the operations to cease, because if we're trying to determine what led to the path's operations to halt, and we're comparing two options, damage or being cut off from chakra due to being dragged into the space, one of these things exists in that statement while the other doesn't. So in order to say that the damage is what caused the operations halting, you have to pull from outside of that statement in order to substantiate that position, while the person claiming that simply being dragged into the space and a function of that in general caused the stoppage has a basis from that in the statement itself, inherently making that position more likely. This would obviously carry over to Kamui, as they are described the same way, as I pointed out earlier, which means that things like the paths of pain shouldn't be able to operate in the Kamui realm. Another feather in the cap here is that Nagato has to be in close proximity to the paths of pain in order to control them, and moving into a separate space technically moves the paths an infinite distance away, meaning that it should break the distance threshold required for the paths of pain to operate. In terms of Kamui being countered by space-time ninjutsu like FTG or summoning, not only does this fly in the face of the inescapable statement I brought up earlier, but also the fact that Obito's chakra becomes undetectable by sensory shinobi after warping away into Kamui, as well as the fact that Jiraiya is undetectable when he enters his barrier space. It's unlikely due to these things that his chakra can be reached. We actually know that sensory does actually work interdimensionally, so Obito being undetectable and having no traces of his chakra left behind helps the case I'm trying to make as well. If his chakra can't be reached or sensed due to being in the Kamui dimension, that makes it more than likely that the chakra also can't be transmitted in or out of the Kamui dimension outside of the utilization of the Kamui eyes, whether in the form of remotely controlling something like a path of pain, or transmission of chakra for moving oneself or something else into or out of Kamui with space-time ninjutsu. Regardless, I think this is a solid case for why the Kamui dimension is truly inescapable. Some people will try to rebuttal this as well by saying, well, Boruto can travel interdimensionally with his inferior FTG. Those dimensions are never stated to be barrier spaces or inescapable, so you'd have to showcase why that would be similar, but that doesn't apply here. Another misconception people have about Kamui is that it can be blocked by things like Susanoo, or more specifically, the Yata Mirror. This is not the case. Basically, the statements I showed earlier that say there's no defense against this technique are evidence enough. Now, whether you think that means Kamui would warp away the Yata Mirror or just circumvent it entirely is up to you, but the Yata Mirror is a defense, and no defense can work against it. I lean in the direction of Kamui being able to warp it away, though, due to the fact that we have a later statement from the Naruto The Last Movie databook, which says it can warp away anything. This would apply to things that we see up to that point, which would obviously include the the Yata Mirror. I mean, think about it. The Yata Mirror is stated to counter all ninjutsu. So are the True Seeker Orbs, yet the True Seeker Orbs can be warped away by Kamui. So if the statements we have say it can warp away anything, and these statements cover the points in the series that the Yata Mirror would be in play, and something else that nullifies ninjutsu in a potentially similar way still falls prey to Kamui's warping, it's likely that there's nothing in the Naruto universe up to that point that can defend against it. The final section of this video will be sort of a putting it all into practice type section, and going over one of the hottest debates in the series to do it. Let's start with my position. It is almost undeniable that Obito used Kamui here for 4 main reasons. Number 1, Kamui works. I described this earlier with how it works against paper bombs, which had tagged him, and with the Fanbook 2 statement, so anyone saying it can't phase through Amaterasu here is just in denial. We also have good reason to believe that Amaterasu can be warped away by Kamui, since it is physical matter, and Kamui is stated to be able to warp away anything. And we also get an instance of Kakashi activating his MS upon facing Amaterasu, most likely to warp it away if needed. Number 2, the databook statement in regards to this says Obito received no damage, or came away unscathed. When you use Izanagi, you lose an eye, and thus have taken damage. Number 3, the databook statement in question also says that he has the ability to vanish into the void as if transcending space. Since we know that Kamui is a jutsu where you literally vanish into the void, transcending space, this is more fitting for how Kamui works as opposed to Izanagi. Number 4, Obito says that if Itachi knew everything about him, he would be dead. Itachi would have good reason to believe that Obito knows about Izanagi, but he does not verifiably know that Obito can phase through attacks after they land. This means Itachi would have used a different strategy if he had more knowledge, like the Totsuka blade as opposed to the Amaterasu. And number 5, Izanagi has to be prepped. It's never something that's shown to work after damage has already been taken, it's always activated before the damage is taken, so it's unlikely that he had the time to do that if he didn't even have the time to activate his phasing. A common rebuttal to this interpretation is that Amaterasu hurt him as he's screaming in pain on panel. Guys, he pretends to get cut in half and falls down when facing Sasuke alongside Deidara. He pretended to be 2 entirely different people for decades. I don't think it's beyond the scope of Obito's normal character to play something up for dramatic effect. Another common rebuttal is that we don't see any damage on him where the Amaterasu hit. This isn't really an issue since he could have began phasing immediately, or at least fast enough to where not even the fibers on his clothes were burned noticeably. We know his clothes are actually able to withstand Suigetsu's sword swings without taking any damage, so they're pretty durable, and even if they weren't, there's another explanation that takes care of that. The Amaterasu simply burns its target faster than it burns non-targeted objects. We see this with Sasuke's wing burning up in moments, while trees, even small shrubs, take a long time to burn, and still don't even show significant damage after that long period of time. A rebuttal to this is that Orochimaru's snake gets burned up pretty quick by the Amaterasu when getting hit by a small wisp, but since the curse mark has Orochimaru's chakra in it, and that snake would as well, it's reasonable to assume that if Itachi was targeting the chakra of the curse mark, then the Amaterasu would respond to both the snake and the wing similarly. That said, the target was Obito's eye here, not his shoulder. We know this with a fair amount of certainty because Obito says the Amaterasu transfer seal was probably set to go off when seeing his eye. So if his shoulder wasn't the target, it's reasonable to assume it would burn significantly slower than his eye would. This again is assuming that he didn't just start phasing immediately, disallowing for the Amaterasu to damage even his clothing to a noticeable degree. As you can see, there are a lot of misconceptions about Kamui that I'm sure some of you had, and even some things I discussed here that I'm sure some of you never considered. If that's you, make sure to let me know in the comments, because I always love to hear your thoughts on these types of videos. But if you made it this far, I just want to say thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you haven't yet, but until next time, have an awesome day.